It is August 12th, 1765, in a British army camp outside Allahabad in northern India. Inside a tent belonging to a company employee named Robert Clive, a ceremony is about to take place that has almost no parallel in the history of government. The man at the center of it is Shah Alam II, Mughal emperor. Heir to Babur, to Akbar, to Aurangzeb, sovereign in name of most of the Indian subcontinent. He has no throne with him, so one is improvised. According to the account most historians follow, the emperor is seated in an armchair, and the armchair has been placed on top of a dining table. That is, the throne of the house of Timur on the day it signs away the richest provinces it has left. And what he signs away is not land. It is something stranger and far more valuable. He grants the Diwani the right to collect the land revenue, the tax of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, 3 provinces, the wealthiest ground in Asia. Now watch who receives it. He does not grant it to a king. He does not grant it to Britain. Britain as a state is not in the tent. He grants it to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, a joint stock corporation whose shares are bought and sold every week in the coffee houses off Threadneedle Street. Understand what has happened? Because almost nothing in modern history looks like it. From this afternoon, the tax paid by somewhere in the region of 20 million people, that is the figure usually given, and it is an estimate, belongs to a company. Its shareholders will receive a dividend, and part of that dividend is now the land tax of Bengal. In return, the emperor is promised 26 lakhs of rupees a year, roughly 260,000 pounds against revenues reckoned on the estimates that survive in the millions. He has rented out the fiscal power of an empire for a fraction of what it yields. 53 years later, an American-born painter working in London, Benjamin West, put this scene on canvas. The emperor enthroned in dignity, Clive receiving the grant, like a gift honorably given. Nobody in that painting sits on a dining table. It is not a record. It is a receipt. And here is the sentence to hold on to, spoken in Westminster Hall 23 years later by a man who chose every word. The East India Company in Asia, said Edmund Burke, is, quote, a state in the disguise of a merchant. Its whole service is a system of public offices in the disguise of a counting house. So how does a trading company end up collecting an empire's taxes? How does it come to field an army reckoned at times to be twice the size of the British Army, and who is actually in that army? And why, 7 years after this afternoon, with the tax revenue of 20 million people running through its books, is this company insolvent, bankrupt, and begging the British state for a rescue? That rescue will end with a shipload of tea in Boston Harbor. Here is the full story. Because the engine of this story is not conquest. It is a balance sheet. The East India Company did not become dangerous by selling things. It became dangerous the day its income stopped, depending on customers, and started depending on taxpayers, on people who could not choose to stop buying. And at that moment, it stopped being a business the British state regulated, and became a single point of failure inside the state's own finances. Between 1699 and 1780, according to a recent study in the journal Past and Present, the company supplied on the order of 30% of Britain's annual customs revenue. It was one of the government's largest creditors and among the largest employers in London. You do not let something like that fail, and in 1772 Britain did not. It rescued it and sent the bill to somebody who could not vote. To see how a company came to hold a sovereign right at all, you have to go back 165 years, to a document almost nobody has read. The 31st of December, 1600, Elizabeth I grants a charter to a petition brought by the Standard Accounts by the Earl of Cumberland and a couple of hundred other subscribers. The grant is a monopoly of 15 years over all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. Half the surface of the earth assigned to one set of investors in a single clause. And here is the proportion that matters. In 1600, England is a peripheral kingdom on the edge of Europe, and the Mughal Empire it is petitioning is one of the richest states on earth. You will often hear that Mughal India made up a quarter of world output against under 2% for England. Treat that with care. The Madison estimates behind it are contested. But the direction is not in dispute. The company arrives as a supplicant. Surat, around 1613, Madras at the end of the 1630s, Bombay, leased from Charles II for a nominal rent, Calcutta at the end of the century. And now we reach the first thing you have probably been told wrong. The popular version says that the East India Company was a private business that went rogue, that it drifted into conquest because nobody was watching and woke up one morning holding an empire. That is not what happened. The powers of conquest were granted to it, in writing, by the king. The Charter of 1661 from Charles II gives the company the right to make war and peace with non-Christian powers, to build fortifications, to coin money, to administer civil and criminal justice, to appoint governors and councils. Further charters in the 1680s extend the same logic. 1661, 96 years before Plassey. Before a single company soldier had taken a province the company already held, on paper the attributes of a state. This is the argument Philip Stern makes in The Company's State. The company thought of itself as a body politic from the 17th century onward. Sovereignty did not creep up on it. It was delegated, deliberately, by a crown that found it cheaper to license an empire than to run one. And here is the detail that explains why the state could never walk away. The monopoly was not a gift. It was a sale. In 1657, Cromwell makes the joint stock permanent, the invention that makes the share tradable. In 1698, Parliament charters a rival company in exchange for a loan of £2 million to the state. In 1708, the two merge under an agreement that includes the government itself, the United Company lending the Treasury over £3 million. That is the machine. The company buys its privileges by lending to the state, and the state, having borrowed, cannot afford to see the lender collapse. Burke named the deformity in Latin. In that same speech of February 1788, quote, "The India Company came to be what it is, a great empire, carrying on subordinately a great commerce. It became that thing which was supposed by the Roman law irreconcilable to reason and propriety. Undum negotiatorum et dominum, the same. Power became the general trader. The same power became the supreme lord. The general trader and the supreme lord. Everything that follows is what happens when one institution is allowed to be both. For a century and a half, the company was a tenant in India. Then, in the spring of 1756, a young man of about 23 came to the throne of Bengal and decided he had had enough of his tenants fortifying their warehouses. His name is Siraj-ud-Dowlah. In June 1756, he takes Calcutta. And here we arrive at the most famous night in the story, the point where a documentary can quietly turn into propaganda. The claim is that British prisoners were shut overnight in a punishment cell so small that most of them suffocated. The figures come from John Zephaniah Holwell, a survivor, 146 shut in, 123 dead by morning. The Black Hole of Calcutta. Now hold those numbers at arm's length. Holwell was a participant, a claimant for compensation, and a man with a career to rebuild, and modern historians, William Dalrymple among them, regard his account as very substantially exaggerated. The number held, the size of the cell, the number who died, all disputed. Something happened that night, and people almost certainly died, but that is not why the story matters. It matters because of what it was used for. The Black Hole became the first great justification narrative of British India, the atrocity that functioned as a permit. And here's the irony. The retribution story cannot survive. The campaign that followed was not fought as revenge. It was arranged in advance as a business transaction with Bengali money. Because Bengal in 1757 has a financial power center, and it is not British. The Jagat Seths are the greatest banking house in Bengal at Murshidabad. This Marwari Jain dynasty holds the minting rights and handles the revenue collection. Several accounts describe them, with some license, as the de facto central bank of Bengal. They have a grievance against the young Nawab, reportedly a personal one, and so they enter into an arrangement that has nothing to do with a dungeon in Calcutta. Siraj-ud-Dowlah will be replaced by Mir Jafar, his own army commander. The bankers will finance it. The company supplies the pretext and the guns. The throne is the price. And then the plot nearly comes apart over money, which is the most honest thing about it. An intermediary named Omachund works out what the conspiracy is worth and demands his cut, threatening to expose everything if he does not get it. Clive's solution is to draw up two treaties, one authentic and one false, the false one containing Omachund's payment and meant to be repudiated afterwards. Admiral Watson refuses to sign a document he knows to be a fraud, so, by the standard account, his signature is forged. Sit with that. The most consequential battle in British imperial history opens with a forgery drafted to cheat the middleman. And it very nearly does not happen at all. On June 21st of June, Clive calls a council of war. Of the 20 officers present, 13, Clive among them, vote against attacking. Then, alone, he reverses his own vote and gives the order to advance. June 23rd, 1757. A mango grove at Plassey, on the bank of the Bhagirathi River, which the English will render as Plassey. The odds, as usually reported, are absurd. Clive has around 3,000 men, perhaps 800 European and 2,100 Indian sepoys, against a Bengali army given at something like 50,000 with French gunners in support. Then the weather intervenes. The monsoon rain comes down at midday. The British cover their powder with tarpaulins. The Bengali gunners, by every account, do not. When the rain stops, one artillery train still works and the other does not. A cavalry charge goes forward against guns that are still firing and is destroyed. Mir Madan, reportedly the only senior commander genuinely loyal to Siraj, is killed. and Mir Jafar, with the bulk of the army, does not move. That was the arrangement. British losses are usually given at around 20 men killed. 20. For a province of tens of millions. So say it plainly, Plassey was not a battle won. It was a contract executed. The fighting was the smallest part of it, and the smallest cost. Siraj-ud-Dawla flees, is caught, and is killed within days. Then comes the settlement, and the settlement is the point. Mir Jafar, installed on the throne he has been sold, is required to pay. The indemnity is commonly given at around 2.8 crore of rupees, on the order of 3 million pounds, and cash, plate, and jewels are taken from the Murshidabad treasury and carried down the Hooghly to Calcutta by boat. Clive's personal share is usually given as 234,000 pounds, though one source puts it lower, and he is granted a jagir, an annual rent charged on Bengal's own revenues, worth around 27,000 pounds a year. Read that twice. A British employee of a London company is paid a private pension for life, out of the taxes of Bengal. And the bankers who financed it? In 1763, a later Nawab, Mir Qasim, had Jagat Seth Mehtab Chand and his cousin Swarup Chand killed, their bodies reportedly thrown from the ramparts of the fort at Munger, 6 years. That is how long the men who bought the coup outlived it. Plassey is the famous name, but Plassey only bought a puppet. The battle that actually decided who ruled came 7 years later, and hardly anybody has heard of it. The 22nd of October 2017-64 at Buxar, a company force under Hector Munro faces a coalition. The Nawab of Awadh, the deposed Mir Qasim, and Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor himself. Plassey defeated one provincial ruler. Buxar defeated the empire. That is why the tent at Allahabad follows 10 months later, and why the emperor signs. Now here is where the threads converge, and where the whole nature of the enterprise changes. Before 1765, the company's Indian trade worked like anybody else's. Ship silver out from Britain, buy textiles and saltpeter and spices, ship them home and sell them, bullion out, goods back. After the Diwani, that stops. The company no longer needs to export silver because it now has a revenue stream inside India. It buys Indian goods and later Chinese goods with Indian tax. Say that slowly because it is the mechanism the whole video turns on. From 1765, the conquest is self-financing. Every rupee raised in Bengal pays the soldier who holds Bengal, and the surplus buys the cargo that sails home to the shareholders. The administrative arrangement makes it worse. It is called the dual government. The company collects the revenue, and the Nawab's officials remain responsible for administering the province. The body with the money has no duty of care, and the body with the duty of care has no money. Nobody is responsible for anything. Remember that when we get to 1770. And now the second thing you have been told wrong, the biggest one. The phrase everybody knows is that a handful of Englishmen conquered India. It is false, and not in a small way. The company's armies at their height are usually given at between 200,000 and 260,000 men across the 3 presidencies. The figures vary with source and year, so take the range, not a single number. Twice the size of the British army at certain periods. But the composition is what matters. Across the 18th century, the ratio of Indian to European troops runs at roughly 7-1. In 1778, 10,926 Europeans against 70,093 Indian soldiers. By 1844, 235,000 Indians to 14,500 Europeans. So here is the accurate sentence. India was conquered by an overwhelmingly Indian army, paid for with Indian tax revenue, commanded by British officers on behalf of shareholders in London. That is the real subject, a triple decoupling. The people who paid, the people who fought, and the people who collected the return were 3 different populations, and only the third had any say in it. Dalrymple's image for the scale is a negation, and it is stronger for that. There is, he writes, no exact modern equivalent. Walmart does not number a fleet of nuclear submarines among its assets. Neither Facebook nor Shell possesses regiments of infantry. The company had both. Meanwhile, in London, they were doing arithmetic. News of the Diwani reaches Britain in 1766, into a country carrying a national debt of around £140 million from the 7 Years' War. And the dividend climbs 6% at the end of 1765, 8 in the summer of 1766, 12.5 by 1767. Parliament, discovering that a private corporation is drawing the tax revenue of a province of 20 million people, opens an inquiry, and then does the most revealing thing in this entire story. It caps the dividend at 10%, and there it stops. It does not nationalize the revenue. It does not reform the administration of Bengal. It takes a cut. In 1767, the company agrees to pay the treasury £400,000 a year, a bargain struck for 2 years, and renewed in 1769, not a share of the profits, a fixed sum owed in good years and bad. The state has become a stakeholder in the enterprise. It is supposed to supervise. Hold that number. It comes back in 5 years. By 1769, the share price is behaving like a fever chart. In May, it touches £273. Within a month, it is back at 239. Contemporaries will remember the whole episode as the Bengal Bubble, and it makes the structural point better than any speech. The valuation of the most valuable company in Britain rested on a tax flow nobody in London could audit, reported by men. 8 months sailing away who were personally enriched by the numbers they sent. Then the rain failed. The Bengal famine of 1770 begins with the weather. Short rains at the end of 1768, then the failure of the summer monsoon of 1769, which destroys the almond harvest around 70% of Bengal's rice. Smallpox follows. Those causes are natural.
What happened next was not.
The death toll is genuinely disputed, and you should hear both sides. The Court of Directors, in May 1770, refers to the loss of around a third of the population. A company official named Becher wrote of 3 in 8. From those contemporary claims comes the figure of roughly 10 million dead, popularized in the late 19th century by W. W. Hunter, and it circulates to this day. It is seriously contested. The demographer Tim Dyson considers 10 million barely credible, since it would require annual mortality to rise around 500%. The historian Rajat Datta proposes something closer to 1.2 million, 4 to 5% of the population, and regards the contemporary estimates as inflated. I'm not going to adjudicate that. But notice the revisionists are arguing about the size of a catastrophe, not its existence. And here's what is not in dispute. It is the fact that carries this section. In the spring of 1770, in the middle of the famine, the land tax was raised by 10%. Proposals for a remission of around 7% had been considered and rejected. Not maintained, raised. The tax on a starving province was increased because the revenue was the security behind a dividend being paid in London. And the most damaging witness against the company is not a radical. It is Adam Smith, the founding theorist of the free market, writing while the survivors were still alive. In The Wealth of Nations, in his digression on the corn trade, quote, "The drought in Bengal a few years ago might probably have occasioned a very great dearth. Some improper regulations, some injudicious restraints imposed by the servants of the East India Company upon the rice trade, contributed perhaps to turn that dearth into a famine. Dearth into famine, a shortage into a mass death. Smith's objection was structural, not moral. An institution that is sovereign and trader at once has two interests, and they point in opposite directions." He returns to it in the chapter on wages, and the sentence is colder still. Quote, "This perhaps is nearly the present state of Bengal, where, notwithstanding 300,000 or 400,000 people die of hunger in 1 year, we may be assured that the funds destined for the maintenance of the laboring poor are fast decaying." And, in the same passage, he sets the mercantile company, which, in his words, oppresses and domineers in the East Indies, against the British Constitution, which protects and governs North America. 2 territories, 1 nation, 2 utterly different outcomes. So the honest formulation is neither of the ones you are offered online, not a planned extermination, not a simple drought either. A climatic catastrophe running into a fiscal machine with no mechanism for stopping, the dual government working exactly as designed. Nobody responsible for anything. And now the turn. Because 2 years after the famine, the company that could not stop collecting could not pay its bills. The crash did not begin in Bengal. It began with a London banker who bet that the East India Company would fall. His name is Alexander Fordyce, a partner in the house of Neil, James, Fordyce and Down, of Threadneedle Street. He speculates against East India stock and, by the standard account, loses around £300,000. On the 8th of June, 1772, his failure becomes public knowledge. On the 9th, he flees to France. On the 12th, the news reaches Scotland. His partners are left liable for something in the region of £243,000. And then the ground gives way, because 18th century banking runs on mutual credit. And the question every banker in London now asks about every other is, who else was lending to Fordyce? June 22nd, 1772, contemporaries call it Black Monday. It is the peak of the panic. 2 days later, the Ayr Bank falls. Douglas, Heron and Company, an institution of the Scottish gentry founded only 3 years earlier. Of its 226 partners, only 112 are reckoned still solvent by August 1775. Count the wreckage. 8 London banks go down in a fortnight. Around 20 fail across Europe. English bankruptcies, averaging around 310 a year between 1764 and 1771, hit 484 in 1772 and 556 in 1773. The Gentleman's Magazine in June 1772, quote, "No event for 50 years past has been remembered to have given so fatal a blow both to trade and public credit." And in the middle of it stands the East India Company in a position that is not survivable. Look at the ledger. Bills of exchange drawn on it in India come to over £1.5 million, 5 times what that same account was worth a year before. It cannot refinance its loan from the Bank of England. Its warehouses are stacked with tea it cannot sell, £18 million in weight, and it still owes the Treasury £400,000 a year. And it cannot pay its bills. And here is what makes the episode modern. The company's collapse would not have been a private misfortune. Its paper was in the vaults of the banks already falling, its receipts were in the government's budget, its shares were the blue chip holding of half the estates in England, which is what makes what happens next the first example of a phrase that had not been invented yet. On the 14th of January 1773, the directors of the East India Company go to the British government and ask for 2 things: a public loan and unrestricted access to the American tea market. They get both. Read that again. A private company, having produced a famine and a crash, applied for public money and a captive market, and was granted both because it was too entangled with the state to be allowed to fail. And the entanglement was not a metaphor. Directors of the company sat in the House of Commons. The government's own revenue depended on the company's trade. The state was not the referee. It was a counterparty. Meanwhile, Parliament did what parliaments do in a crisis. It put a man on trial instead of a system. A select committee under General John Burgoyne investigates Robert Clive, who had acknowledged those £234,000 in presents after Plassey and returned to England in 1767 with a fortune reported at £401,000. And his reply is the most famous line in the history of the company. Confronted with the treasure of Bengal laid open before him, he is supposed to have said, "By God, Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation," a line that first appears in a biography of 1848, so treated as legend, not. Transcript. The censure failed. On the 21st of May, 1773, the Commons resolved instead that Clive had rendered great and meritorious services to his country. He died the following year, by his own hand. The state wrote the check. Now look at what it asked in return, and at who ended up paying. The loan is £1.4 million, advanced by Lord North's government so the company can meet its liabilities, and it comes with a leash. Until that money is repaid, the dividend is capped at 6%. A corporation that had been paying 12.5% now pays what its creditor permits. The rest of the conditions come in the Regulating Act of 1773. Company servants are forbidden to trade privately or accept presents, closing the door Clive walked through. And it creates a government. The governor of Bengal becomes Governor General, with Madras and Bombay subordinated to him. The first man in the post is Warren Hastings. But look at the flaw, because it is deliberate. The Governor General is given a council of 4 and no veto. He can be outvoted by his own board. That defect is not corrected until Pitt's India Act of 1784. So the first great regulatory response to a corporate bailout was a supervisor designed from the outset to be able to lose the argument. And then there is the second condition, the part almost nobody is taught. The Tea Act passed on the 10th of May, 1773. It is not a new tax on the American colonies. That is the misunderstanding at the center of the whole story. What it does is let the East India Company ship its tea directly to America, with duties refunded at the British end, undercutting everyone. The Townshend duty of 3p a pound stays, but the tea gets cheaper. Its explicit purpose is to move the mountain of unsold tea in the London warehouses, £18 million in weight, off the company's books and into American teapots. In other words, Parliament recapitalized a failing corporation by force-feeding its inventory to a market that had not asked for it. The colonial reaction was not only constitutional, it was commercial. Something like 85% of the tea drunk in America was smuggled Dutch tea, and cheap legal company tea threatened an established business, which is why merchants and constitutionalists found themselves on the same side of the harbor. December 16th, 1773, Boston. The ships are the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. 342 chests go into the water, 92,000 pounds of tea, valued at the time near £9,500. You have heard this story your whole life as a tax revolt. Now hold the accurate version alongside it. That tea belonged to the East India Company. It was in Boston Harbor because the British Parliament had bailed the company out and needed somewhere to put the collateral. The men in the water that night were destroying the assets of a bailed-out corporation. The American Revolution has many causes, and I will not flatten them into one. But that cargo, on that night, in that harbour, was there because a company in London could not pay its debts. The rescue worked, and the machine, having been saved, went looking for new revenue. In 1773, the year of the bailout, Warren Hastings gives the company a monopoly over the opium of Bengal, and the structure is built for distance. The company does not smuggle, it grows the crop and auctions it at Calcutta, and private merchants carry it into China, where it is illegal. The revenue arrives clean. The crime happens 2 owners downstream. Now watch the chronology, because this is where almost every retelling goes wrong. The company's China monopoly ends in 1833 and 1834. The First Opium War begins in 1839. By the time the gunboats sailed, the company was no longer the trader. It had built the machine, and the machine outlived it and went to war without it. And what of the men who ran it? Britain put one of them on trial, and it was the greatest public spectacle of the age. The impeachment of Warren Hastings opens in Westminster Hall on February 13, 1788. It runs 7 years and 148 sitting days, the longest trial in British parliamentary history, and it left Hastings financially ruined. The prosecutor is Edmund Burke. 5 years before the trial, speaking on Fox's East India Bill, he had described the men the company sent out. Quote, young men, boys, almost governed there, without society and without sympathy with the natives. There is nothing before the eyes of the natives but an endless, hopeless prospect of new flights of birds of prey and passage. Every rupee of profit made by an Englishman is lost forever to India. On the 4th day of his opening at the impeachment, February 19, 1788, Burke delivered the peroration. Quote, I impeach Warren Hastings, Esquire, of high crimes and misdemeanors. I impeach him in the name of the Commons of Great Britain in Parliament assembled, whose parliamentary trust he has betrayed. I impeach him in the name of all the Commons of Great Britain, whose national character he has dishonoured. I impeach him in the name of the people of India, whose laws, rights, and liberties he has subverted, whose properties he has destroyed, whose country he has laid waste and desolate. I impeach him in the name and by virtue of those eternal laws of justice which he has violated. I impeach him in the name of human nature itself, which he has cruelly outraged, injured, and oppressed in both sexes, in every age, rank, situation, and condition of life. On the 23rd of April, 1795, Warren Hastings was acquitted on effectively every charge. And that acquittal is not a footnote. It is the verdict on the whole system. Britain staged the most elaborate moral reckoning in its parliamentary history, spent 7 years on it, punished nobody, and changed nothing structural. The man was tried. The machine kept running. Now I want to be careful, because this is not a conspiracy story, and it would be dishonest to sell it as one. There was no plan. Nobody in 1600 designed what happened in 1765. The men who obtained the Diwani were improvising with an opportunity created by the collapse of Mughal central authority, a collapse they exploited and did not cause. And the popular image of an all-powerful nabob lobby-buying parliament does not survive contact with the numbers. Between 1768 and 1831, returning East India men in the Commons average around 20 per parliament, and historians who have studied them stress they were not a coherent bloc. The real capture was not a faction. It was a diffuse interpenetration between the Commons, the Lords, the Crown, and the offices on Leadenhall Street, where nobody had to be bribed because everybody was already invested. You should also hear the strongest voice on the other side. Tirthankar Roy argues the company must be judged against the Indian rulers it actually replaced, not an imagined alternative, and that much of the treasure came out of a nawab's treasury rather than cultivators' fields. Most of his colleagues disagree sharply, but the argument exists, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the tidy story this channel takes apart. One more piece of housekeeping: you will very often read that the company came to control half the world's trade. That claim rests on nothing. The defensible version is not a share of trade at all. It is a share of the tax, something like 30% of Britain's customs revenue every year between 1699 and 1780. Extraordinary, and an entirely different claim. So what is the real lesson when the flags and the mango grove are taken away? It is not that a company became a state. That is the version that lets everyone off, because it sounds like an accident. The lesson is that a state outsourced its sovereignty to a corporation, then discovered the corporation had become the single point of failure in its own public finances, and once that is true, the state will always rescue it. Not out of corruption, out of arithmetic. And then it sends the bill somewhere else. In 1773, the bill went to 2 places, and neither was Westminster. To Bengal as a tax that could not be reduced, in a province that had just buried an unknown number of its people. And to America as a market opened by force so a warehouse in London could be emptied. One of those 2 constituencies could riot in a harbour. The other could not. That is why the East India Company matters more than any other corporation in history. Not because of what it took, but because of what it proved that too big to fail is not a modern invention of bankers. It is a structural condition demonstrated in full in London in 1772, with a fleet, an army, and a famine attached. The end is the quietest part of the story and the most fitting. After the revolt of 1857, which began among sepoys of its own army, in a force where Indian soldiers outnumbered British ones several times over, the Government of India Act of August 2, 1858 transferred its territories and revenues to the Crown. But the company was not dissolved in 1858. Read that again. It survived for the specific purpose of continuing to draw annuities out of Indian taxpayers and pass them to its shareholders, now through the Government of India. It took the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act of 1873 to finish it. On June 1, 1874, the East India Company ceased to exist, bought out generously by an Act of Parliament. It did not die in battle, or in revolution, or in disgrace. It was redeemed. In the accounting sense of the word, a company that had governed a subcontinent was closed the way you close a bond issue. So here's my question. If a company today grew large enough that its collapse would take the tax base down with it, do you believe for 1 second it would be allowed to fail? And if it were, who would be sent the bill? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you made it this far, drop a tea chest below so I know you stayed to the end. If this kind of deep dive is why you come here, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.